The worst part wasn't finding the account, it was the name on it. I was looking for the car insurance renewal. That's all I was doing. Harold had kept every paper we'd ever owned in a gray metal filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, the one we'd always meant to turn into a guest room and never did. I knew that cabinet the way. I knew the back of my own hand. 38 years of marriage means you know where a man keeps his things. The folder I pulled out was labeled Savings, Joint. But when I opened it, the paperwork inside wasn't joint. Harold's name, an address I didn't recognize, and a beneficiary listed as someone named Lynette Corso. I stood there for a long time. Lynette Corso. I said it out loud, to the empty room, like saying it might make sense. It didn't. I put the folder back. I found the car insurance. I went downstairs and made dinner. Harold came home at 6:15 like he always did, and I set a plate in front of him, and I watched him eat, and I thought, who is Lynette Corso? Harold had been gone for 4 months by then. Heart attack, February. A Tuesday morning, he was putting on his shoes to go to the gym. He didn't make it to the door. I thought I knew everything about the man I'd buried. We met when I was 24. He was 27, working at his uncle's hardware store, saving up to open his own business. I was teaching 2nd grade. We got married in a small ceremony at my parents' church. My dress cost $60, and I've never once regretted that. We built things together. That's the only way I know how to put it. The house, the savings, 2 children, our son, who I'll call my older one, and our daughter, my younger one. Harold's business grew into something real, a plumbing supply company that eventually had 12 employees. I went back to work part-time when the kids were in middle school, kept teaching until I was 62. We weren't a perfect couple. We had our quiet years, the ones where you're more roommates than husband and wife. We had arguments about money, about the kids, about whose turn it was to deal with the thing that needed dealing with. But I never doubted him. That's the part I keep coming back to. I never once doubted him. The day after I found the folder, I waited until my older one called me. He calls every Sunday, that hasn't changed, and I asked him in the most ordinary voice I could manage if his father had ever mentioned anyone named Lynette. There was a pause. Not a confused pause. Not the pause of someone searching their memory. A different kind of pause. He said he wasn't sure. I said, take your time. He said, the name doesn't ring a bell, Mom. But his voice had changed. Something in it had gone flat. I've been listening to that voice for 41 years. I know every register it has. I said, okay, and I let him change the subject. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark on Harold's side of the bed. I'd started sleeping there after he died. I don't know why exactly. Maybe to feel less like half of something. And I thought about that pause. The next morning, I called my younger one. She answered on the second ring, cheerful, a little rushed. She's always a little rushed. I asked her the same question. Did your father ever mention anyone named Lynette Corso? She said, where did you hear that name? Not who is that, not I don't know any Lynette. She said, where did you hear that name? I said I found some paperwork, and she said, Mom, I think you should just let it go. I said, excuse me? She said it again, softer this time, like she was asking a favor. She said, Dad's gone. It doesn't matter anymore, let it go. I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The coffee went cold. The sun moved across the floor. Both of them knew. Whatever this was, both of my children knew about it and had chosen, for however long this had been going on, not to tell me. I want to be careful about how I say what came next, because I've had months to think about it and I still don't have the right words. There's a specific kind of grief that comes from discovering that the people you believed were on your side were standing somewhere else entirely. It's not like losing someone. It's more like finding out a door you've been walking through for your whole life was painted on the wall. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was more like cold. Like the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees and I was the only one who noticed. I went back to the filing cabinet. I wasn't careful this time. I wasn't looking for the car insurance. I went through every folder, every document, every envelope. I found the savings account papers. I found that it had been opened 11 years ago. Harold had been contributing to it steadily, a few $100s a month, nothing dramatic, nothing that would have been visible against the background of our finances. The balance was significant. Not enormous, but significant. I found a second folder near the back, unmarked. Inside was a deed, not to our house, to a property in a town about 40 minutes from here, a small house on a street I'd never heard of. Harold's name on the deed, and below his as joint tenant, Lynette Corso. I sat down on the floor of the spare bedroom with that deed in my lap. 11 years. He'd had a second property for 11 years, and I had never known. He'd been putting money away for 11 years, and I had never known. And my children who called on Sundays, who came for Christmas, who stood beside me at his funeral and held my hand, they had known. For how long, I couldn't say. But they had known. I didn't confront anyone right away. I'm not sure I could have gotten the words out. What I did instead was call a lawyer. A woman I'd seen recommended in a neighborhood group, someone who handled estates. I made an appointment and I drove there on a Wednesday afternoon, and I sat across from her desk and I told her what I'd found. She was very patient with me. She explained some things I hadn't understood before. Harold's name was on our house as joint tenants with right of survivorship, which meant the house came to me automatically when he died. That part was fine, but the savings account and the deed to the other property were in his name alone, with Lynette Corso named as beneficiary on the account and joint tenant on the deed, which meant those assets had passed to her directly, outside of probate, outside of his will, outside of anything I could have seen coming. I asked if there was anything I could do. She said there might be grounds to contest, depending on when the account was opened relative to our marriage and the laws of our state, but it would require time and money, and there were no guarantees. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Who is she? Is there any way to find out?" She said she couldn't help me with that part. I drove home. I made a grocery list. I went to the store. I bought chicken and celery and a bunch of dill. I came home and I made soup, the long, slow kind that takes all afternoon, and I stood in the kitchen stirring it, and I let myself cry for the first time since finding the deed. Not about Harold, or not only about Harold, about the version of my life I'd thought I was living. I didn't know how to find Lynette Corso. I'm 67 years old, and I was not raised to think of myself as someone who tracks people down. But I thought about that savings account. 11 years. A deed with her name on it. Whatever this was, she had been a part of Harold's life for a long time. I wanted to understand it, not to fight her for the money. I needed to understand. My neighbor, a woman in her 50s, practical, no nonsense, she helped me. I won't go into the details. Let's just say that within a few days I had an address. The same address that was on the account paperwork, as it turned out. The town was 40 minutes away. Small streets, older houses, the kind of neighborhood that was probably lively once and had gone quiet. The house was a one-story brick with a good front garden. Somebody had planted tulips along the walkway. They were just starting to come up. I sat in my car for a while. I almost drove away twice. Then I got out. The woman who came to the door was older than I expected. My age, maybe a year or two younger. White hair cut close. Cardigan the color of moss. She looked at me and something moved across her face. Recognition, then something else. She said my name. I said yes. She didn't seem surprised. She stood back and held the door open. I went inside. She made tea. I sat at her kitchen table while she moved around the kitchen with the particular economy of a person who has lived alone for a long time. The house was clean and quiet. There was a cat sleeping on a chair in the corner. There were books on every flat surface. I asked her how she knew Harold. She set the mugs down and sat across from me and told me they had grown up in the same town, known each other as teenagers, lost touch when Harold moved away and married me, found each other again. I'm not going to speculate about how, it doesn't matter, about 12 years ago. She said that for a period of about 2 years she and Harold had been involved. She said it plainly, without apology and without drama, And I sat there with my hands around my mug and I listened. She said it had ended. Her choice. She said she had told Harold she wasn't willing to continue in a situation that asked her to be invisible. That if he wasn't going to leave, she wasn't going to stay. I looked up at her. She said he didn't leave. She said, but he also didn't stop. Not entirely. She said he kept sending money. She said she told him to stop, but he didn't stop. She said she'd set most of it aside because it felt wrong to spend it, but she hadn't known how to return it without opening a conversation she'd already closed. I said, "The house." She looked down at her mug. She said she hadn't known about the deed. Not until he died and a lawyer called her. She said she'd been horrified. She said she'd tried to find out how to transfer it back, but it was complicated, and she hadn't known my name or how to reach me, and she'd been sitting with it for 4 months not knowing what to do. I looked at her across the table. This woman with her moss green cardigan and her sleeping cat and her tulips coming up by the front walk. I believed her. I didn't expect to, but I did. We sat there for almost 2 hours. We didn't become friends. I don't think either of us wanted that, but we talked, the way women talk when they've both been handling something heavy and they finally set it down in the same room. She told me things about Harold I'd suspected and things I hadn't. She wasn't trying to wound me with them. She was just filling in the spaces, the same way I was. I told her a little about who he had been at home, not to defend him, just because she seemed to want to know. Before I left, she said she would work with her lawyer to transfer the deed to me. She said the account money was different and more complicated, but she'd talked to someone about it. She said she was sorry, not for the affair, not exactly, she didn't apologize for that directly, but for the way it had all landed on me. For the years of not knowing. I thanked her for the tea. I meant it. I drove home in the early evening with the windows down. The fields outside town were that particular green that only happens in April, almost too bright to look at. I kept my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, and I didn't try to sort through everything I was feeling. There was too much of it and I was too tired. A week later, I called my son. I told him I'd been to see Lynette Corso. I told him I knew he'd known. I told him that I wasn't calling to argue and I wasn't calling to punish him, but that I needed to understand one thing. How long had he known and why hadn't he told me? He was quiet for a while. Then he said he'd found out about 6 years ago. He said he'd confronted his father. He said Harold had cried and promised it was over and begged him not to say anything to me, said it would destroy the family. My son said he believed him. He said he'd told himself it was over. It was in the past. There was no reason to hurt me with it. I said, "It wasn't your call to make." He said, "I know." I said, "You let me stand at his funeral believing something that wasn't true. You let me grieve a version of a man that you knew wasn't complete." He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't expect one. I told him I loved him. I meant that too. But I also told him that something between us had changed and that it was going to take me time to figure out what it looked like now. He said he understood. I think he did. My daughter called me that night, before I called her. She'd heard from her brother. She cried through most of the conversation. She'd found out 3 years ago, she said, also from a confrontation with her father. Same story, same promise from Harold, same decision to protect the version of the family they wanted to believe in. I let her cry. I didn't cry with her. I think I was past the part where I could cry about this particular thing. I said, "I'm going to need some time." She said, "I understand, Mom." I said, "I know you thought you were protecting me." She said, "Yes." I said, "The thing you were actually protecting was your own picture of your father. That's okay. But you should know that's what it was." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You're right." And she sounded surprised, like she'd never thought of it that way before. I called the lawyer again in May. The process of getting the deed addressed took several months, but eventually it was sorted. The money was more complicated, as Lynette had said, and in the end, I didn't recover all of it. Some battles cost more to fight than they're worth, and I've reached an age where I know the difference. What I came away with was the house, which was mine anyway. My savings, which were mine. and a much clearer picture of the life I had actually lived, as opposed to the one I thought I was living. Those are different things. I'm still learning how to hold them both. People ask me sometimes, neighbors, my sister, the women in my Thursday morning walking group, how I'm doing, what my life looks like now. I try to answer honestly. I started something I'd put off for years, a small mail-order business selling dried herb bundles and wreaths from my garden. Nothing dramatic. I'd always grown things and always given them away, and someone suggested I try selling them, and so I do. It gives me somewhere to put my hands. I have breakfast with my sister on Fridays. I've started going to a different church, not because I needed God to change, but because I needed the room to change. I see my children. It's different now, and different doesn't mean worse. It just means I'm no longer pretending the ground beneath us is solid when it isn't. We're building something new, the three of us. I don't know yet what it will look like when it's done. Some mornings, I stand at the kitchen window with my coffee, and I watch the birds at the feeder I hung in March. A cardinal comes most mornings. He's very particular about where he lands. I think about Harold some days with love, and some days with something that isn't love, and some days with an exhaustion that doesn't have a clean name. All of those things are true at the same time. I've stopped trying to choose between them. He was my husband for 38 years. He was also someone I didn't fully know. Both of those things are true. I'm 67 years old, and I am still learning how to let them both be true at the same time. The tulips by Lynette's front walk were yellow. I didn't notice that until I was already driving away. I don't know why it stayed with me, but it did. I planted tulips this fall along my own front walkway, yellow ones. It seemed like the right thing to do. I've thought a lot about what Harold's choices cost. Not in dollars, not in square footage or account balances, but in the quieter things. The Sunday phone calls that will never quite sound the same. The way my daughter pauses now before she speaks, like she's measuring the weight of words for the first time in her life. The way my son looks at me sometimes with something in his eyes that I think might be shame, and how I've had to learn to let that be his to carry and not mine to fix. There's a thing that happens when secrets finally come out into the open. You'd think it would feel like relief, and sometimes it does. But more often it feels like you've been handed a map of a place you thought you already knew, and every road you were certain of is drawn differently than you remembered. You're not lost. You're just oriented to a truth you weren't prepared for. Harold made his choices over a long stretch of years, quietly, consistently, in a way that required a lot of small decisions to sustain. That's the part that took me longest to reckon with. Not one catastrophic moment, but 1,000 ordinary ones where he chose what he chose and then went on with the day, set the money aside, kept the deed, came home at 6:15, ate dinner. I used to think of integrity as something dramatic, as standing up in a moment of crisis and doing the right thing when the stakes are high and everyone is watching. I don't think of it that way anymore. I think integrity is the accumulation of the small choices, the ones nobody sees, the ones you make when you're alone with a folder in a filing cabinet and no one is going to know either way. Lynette made her own choices too. She stepped back when she understood what staying would cost. I don't give her credit for being saintly. She was a person in a complicated situation, like the rest of us. But I think about the fact that when I showed up at her door, she opened it. She made tea. She told me the truth, even though she didn't owe it to me, and it wasn't easy. That took something. I'm not sure what to call it except a kind of honesty that Harold, for all his other qualities, never found the courage to offer me. My children learned something they didn't expect, I think, in the months after all of this came out. They learned that protecting someone's feelings and protecting someone's dignity are not the same thing. What they thought they were doing for me, keeping me from pain, was actually keeping me from the truth of my own life. And a person can only make clear choices when they can see clearly. They took that from me for years, with good intentions and real love, and still the effect was the same as if they hadn't loved me at all. I don't say that to be harsh. I say it because it's true. And because I think the most useful thing any of us can do for the people we love is to let them stand on solid ground, even when the truth is the hard part of the foundation. I planted tulips this fall, yellow ones along the front walk. Every morning I look at them coming up and I think, you don't get to choose what you were handed, but you do get to choose what you plant next. That's the only lesson I know how to offer. It took me 67 years and a gray filing cabinet to learn it.